Welcome to Non-Beta Alpha. Today we discuss the recent developments in the investigation of the JFK assassination on the anniversary of JFK's fateful day in Dallas. We discuss this in hopes of enlightening our viewers of some of the historical events and how historical moments of the past may impact our view of the moment that we are living through today.
Dory, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Nice to be here, Ryan.
Well, we're here today to talk, not in your day job role, but in one of your hobbies or passions, to talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And it is a genuine mystery that has been concealed for generations, and there really hasn't been the same level of scrutiny on other parts of history where several minutes of history can be packed, in space and time with such a weird set of coincidences, with such a weird sense of haphazard items of history that kind of coterminously all smashed together to create an unsolved mystery, if you will. And I know there's theories out there. There's been a lot of theories. There's been movies made, investigations, congressional testimony, academic careers made and launched. But it seems that in this lifespan, there just really hasn't been any finality to this. And we just saw President Biden postpone the documents that were supposed to be released in October, now getting pushed to sometime next year. And in the spirit of truth, I think it's important to continue to have this conversation until some historical, determination is made. But I also think it's really timely and relevant because as people look at what their government is capable of, or what happens in the back channels of, government conversations, what governments are capable of as we're going through a pandemic, as perhaps a Wuhan lab was accidentally or purposely leaked. Just thinking about historical perspective as we face certain conversations that need to go on today about some of the current events, and getting people's mind wrapped around what governments were willing to do to maintain power and control back in the 60s. And so with that, I'd love to, you're an expert in this field. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the JFK assassination today and a little bit about the context around that.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Let's start with, what do we know and not know? I like to use the metaphor of a large jigsaw puzzle and perhaps a giant ballroom of a hotel. And the pieces are maybe the 1 inch square, 2 inch square. We'll never have all the pieces to the puzzle. A lot of the pieces have been lost or destroyed. But what's interesting after all these years, close to 60 years now, is how many pieces we have and how many pieces still keep being found even today. Now that might shock some people, but unless you're kind of tuned into this kind of research, you really don't know about the pieces, and you don't know that a piece is relevant because it's such a big picture and so complicated. You'd have no way of knowing it goes to this puzzle in this giant ballroom. So what's interesting is, though, we have a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And if we climb a ladder in that ballroom and look down at the puzzle, we can see the picture of what happened. And it's getting clearer and clearer all the time. So working from the back up, let's say, let's just look at this Biden administration decision to keep documents, top secret or hidden from the public. Now we're talking close to 60 years here. Wow. That's a long time. What in the world can they claim? Now, the classic intel community is national security, and they lobby the administration to do that. So for the first 30 years, or up to 1991 anyway, that was the claim by the intel agencies, and everyone played ball. And they had the documents sealed and that are still sealed from the Assassinations Review. I forgot the name of that committee, but House Select Committee Assassinations thing that was set up in 1976. Those records are still
the Warren Commission?
Yeah, no, the Warren Commission was extended several times. And there are still things for the Warren Commission sealed. And then in 1991, when Oliver Stone's movie came out, there was such an outcry by the public that Congress was forced to set up the Assassination Records Review Board. And then that created a bunch of top secret documents, and those were sealed for another 25 years. And then those came up during the Trump administration, and the CIA, again in the name of national security, had those extended to 2021, and now we have Biden extending those. Now, let's just examine this behavior. What can we use some a little deductive reasoning on what's going on here? If we look in those documents, are we going to find a smoking gun in there? Probably not. Those records are destroyed. Those records, a lot of records are destroyed, and we spend a lot of time on that. But what happens is over the years, people die, people leave, and the puzzle is so big, they slip up and leave pieces of the puzzle in the documents that really aren't smoking guns, but they're interesting pieces to the puzzle. So I'll give you an example. In the Trump release in 2017, there was a memo released from Herbert Hoover dated 11/24/63. Well, it's 2 days after the assassination, right? And in the memo, it says, and this is the day Ruby assaulted Oswald. Now, anybody with room temperature IQ could say, you know, what the heck do you know in a couple of days? Everything is still happening, right? Everything is still happening. It's happening really fast. Yet in the memo, Hoover says, the thing I'm concerned about, and so is Mr. Katzenbach, is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin. Now, that doesn't mean that J. Edgar Hoover shot Kennedy. But it is an interesting comment that there's no investigation and they've already got an open and shut case. What is that? You know, and the day after the assassination, Katzenbach, who's the Deputy Attorney General, puts out a memo. So obviously he'd been thinking about it, so that since Hoover wrote about it the day before, says the public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large, and that evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial. Speculation about Oswald's motivation ought to be cut off, and we should have some basis for rebutting thought that this was a communist conspiracy, a right-wing conspiracy to blame it on the communists, or unfortunately the facts on Oswald seem all about too pat, too obvious. The Dallas police have put out statements on communist conspiracy theory. It was they who were in charge when he was shot, thus silence. Katzenbach's memo advocated a public FBI report to satisfy this objective. Okay, though he noted the possible need for the appointment of a presidential commission of unimpeachable personnel to review and examine the evidence and announce its conclusions. He ended by advocating a quick public announcement to head off speculation or congressional hearings of the wrong sort. And LBJ made sure and told the Attorney General, there will be no trial in Texas, period. No trial. So here we have the administration, all within a couple of days of the assassination, saying no trial, no conspiracy, no Confederates at large, that Oswald did it, and the FBI ought to put out a report to do it. And it was that report, basically, that was put out by December that was used by the Warren Commission to come up to their conclusions. Well, so what can we glean for this? 3 questions arise out of this. How certain can we be that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone killer when the body's hardly even cold and being put in the ground? How certain can we be there aren't Confederates at large when you just take one small smidgen of evidence, and let's say every doctor at Parkland said there was an entry wound in the front and Oswald was in the back? How can we be so sure after 2 days? No forensics, no analysis. Here's the key. Is this some kind of, when they claim national security, Is that really what it is? Because is this memo a national security interest? No. When he got released by Trump, did the United States fall under Russian control? Were we invaded by Cuba? Why is this memo being hidden all these years? Obviously, the intel establishment is committed to shut down any kind of investigation and hiding the truth and lying to its people. And when you do that, you put yourself in a position, even if you're innocent, of looking guilty.
Well, what is the context? So a lot of Americans, unfortunately, civics is not taught as much as it should be today. And a lot of Americans look at this as just a footnote in history. But there was a lot going on in the 50s and 60s, post-World War II. I mean, maybe you can talk just a brief amount about who was JFK, their family history, why it's potentially sordid, who is RFK, and the different cast of characters that were, creating the context for tension, perhaps, in domestic politics at that time.
Why would, let's suppose the government or elements of the CIA or elements of the government were involved, without talking about the evidence yet. But let's just suppose that happened. Why would they do that? Which is kind of what you're getting at. What's the framework? How could I believe something so preposterous if I don't understand why? And when Kennedy came to office, his dad was very connected to the mob, and the mob, helped him get elected. Okay. And he got his brother involved as Attorney General, and they decided to go hard at the mob. Okay. Now, in the mob's mind, we got you elected, we should have favors, but that was to Pa. That was to Papa Joe. That wasn't to John and Robert. They were idealistic. They wanted to do some right things. Okay. And what they found out is that they were a couple of Harvard boys, young, pretty boys, having their sexcapades, and there were a lot of people jealous of them. The establishment, they were not part of the establishment. And the establishment means the government. I'm not talking about the mob. I'm talking about the government. Every single one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were against John F. Kennedy and his policy on nuclear war. Now, what seems obvious today is that, i.e., no one could win a nuclear war, mutually assured destruction. That's a concept that was new at the time, and JFK is the one that came up with it. In the Defense Department's mind, and Intel Department, and we have to give them some leniency here, okay, because that's what they truly believed in their heart of hearts, that a nuclear war was winnable, and that we had to strike first.
So not a lot of people know. So, Joseph Kennedy, his father, was tied to the mob through bootlegging, and that's well documented, I believe, up in Boston. But question for you is, how did, or what is the context in which the mob helped JFK get elected in 1960?
Votes, just like they do today. We have questionable vote gathering system today, and they have questionable vote gatherings then. So maybe it happens on both sides or whatever, but the mob went to the side of JFK and they got him elected because if you remember 1960, that was a very, very close election. And barely won, the closest one in history, and it was a surprise, very, very big surprise. So the mob helped get him elected because without their help, they wouldn't have got those votes, illegal or legal or whatever they did. They control a lot of unions and voting booths and whatnot. So when you look at the context of what was going on, JFK was under a lot of pressure. And he kept making decisions that were alienating the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the intelligence community, and the defense community. What were those? First of all, when you look at what happened, say, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, okay, we haven't known this until recently, right? So these are pieces of the puzzle that have come out. So, for example, if you look at Khrushchev's son, who's written a book about this, that lives up in New York, and released a lot of paperwork from his dad, Khrushchev actually winds up kind of being a hero here. What Khrushchev and JFK found out is that JFK had less control over his intel communities than Khrushchev had of his. Neither one of them wanted nuclear war. Both of them were under major pressure to go to war. Turns out Khrushchev had more control. JFK had lost control. And to make matters appear worse, JFK had to develop his own intel lines of communication to get to Khrushchev to indicate such. Now, by doing so, obviously the CIA and everyone found out. So obviously, if you're CIA and you think JFK is a bad guy and a communist and a traitor, and he's got his own lines of communication to Khrushchev, you're thinking the worst. So it didn't help things.
Well, and there was also that ominous kind of quote from President Eisenhower, I believe, about the military-industrial complex. I mean, and Eisenhower was a general, right? He fought in the war. For him to say that he was concerned about it going into the Kennedy administration.
Look at the context of which he said it, too. He talked about his warnings. It was very much like George Washington, who had his farewell address, some warnings for us. Well, Eisenhower had one warning, and it was about the military-industrial complex taking over in 1960, and it was in a televised farewell address. It was huge, and he's not the only one to kind of ominously warn us about what happened. If you look in the Wall Street Journal in December of 1963, December 22nd, to be honest with you, that's exact with you, that's 1 month exactly to the day of Kennedy being shot, Truman writes an op-ed piece bemoaning the fact that he had created the CIA and that the CIA had gone out of its original plan from reporting to the presidents as an intel operation to a rogue agency. And he said there's something ominous about the way these guys are doing business that needs to be looked at or possibly even shut down. Nothing happens. But if you're paying attention and you read that kind of stuff, you're like, that's a big statement from a president. He obviously had it. So there's two guys really worried and wondering about what's going on. And with all the research and background and stuff that we have nowadays, you can find more data points like that with both of those. Cuban Missile
and so
what do you have?
Cuban Missile Crisis, yep.
Yeah, Khrushchev is the one that turned the ships around, right? Yeah. You had this one Russian, thank God he had an order to fire the missile and he decided not to. Kennedy had no control. So Kennedy did the right strategy, but he had no control. Without Khrushchev, we're screwed. In the Berlin tank crisis, it was the Russians who turned their tanks around. And then if you listen to Fletcher Prouty, do you know who Fletcher Prouty is?
No.
Fletcher Prouty, a lot of times people go, oh, all this conspiracy stuff is, you couldn't keep it secret. There'd be insiders that talk and they would say something and there's just no way to keep this stuff quiet. There'd be a high level official somewhere. Well, Fletcher Prouty is that high level official. Lieutenant Colonel, he was in charge of the Office of Special Operations for the Secretary of Defense and the Office of Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon, 62 and 63. It was his job to make sure that the CIA had access to all the weaponry and materials and things that they needed from the Air Force or other defense agencies in their clandestine operations around the world. He is the man, okay? And he is your whistleblower. If you look at the movie JFK, Donald Sutherland plays this made-up character, Mr. X. And Oliver Stone wouldn't say for years who it was. That's who it was, Fletcher Prouty. And Fletcher Prouty says the death sentence for JFK was when he wrote in October of 1963 the memo number 263 ordering all the troops out of Vietnam. That was it for him. And what's interesting, and this happened to me growing up, is the history books that I grew up reading in the 70s and the 80s and the 60s was that JFK escalated Vietnam and LBJ continued to escalate it. There's no mention of that memo because it didn't show up for a number of years. It was hidden.
So you have a military-industrial complex heated because they think there might be a non-establishment potentially compromised, whether it's the sexcapades or gambling, somebody who probably couldn't pass a lifestyle polygraph if you had to give the president one. Looking down the barrel of nuclear war with the Russians and not having total control, there's another group that comes into play. And it's ironic that these groups are all tied together in this point of history, which is we'll call it the far right or the Cuban exiles and the Bay of Pigs historical context. Can you maybe cover a little bit about the players there and how Fidel Castro, obviously with Cuban Missile Crisis, but how that came to become another plausible theory?
Yeah, under an Army general, there was an operation called Operation Mongoose, which was to manage Castro and perhaps even take him out. And they were in charge of these Cuban exiles and training and dealing with them in different Miami, down at JM Wave Station, and New Orleans and Louisiana. And somehow Ed Lansdale, another character you need to know about in this, is the guy that wound up in charge of that. Now, Ed Lansdale is probably the number one operator of clandestine operations under Allen Dulles from World War II through the late 60s in Vietnam. A little bit psycho, really, to be honest with you, but very, very good at what he did. He was really important in the Philippines and the takeover and replacement of the president there. He did some in South America, and he was also in charge of putting the president, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a dishwasher in New York, in as president of Vietnam. So, and he accomplished all these things. But what's interesting about this guy is he had a blank check on Operation Mongoose. And Operation Mongoose, the data and the evidence has been pointing to over the last dozen years or so, looks like the vehicle that could have been used to assassinate the president, and in all likelihood probably was used to assassinate the president.
So we're looking at organized crime, we're looking at military-industrial complex, we're looking at, the communists. I mean, what is the theory, or who are some of the players besides Khrushchev that would have been brazen enough? It seems like from your commentary that the Soviets were perhaps more level-headed or stoking us, but willing to pull back because they realized that Kennedy was not in control of the military. But were there hardliners in Russia that could have been, a rogue element in the Soviet apparatus to come and do something like this?
It's certainly possible. Because Khrushchev didn't have 100% control of his KGB either, right? Now, having said that, Russia has nothing to gain by taking out Kennedy and starting a nuclear war that they would lose at that point in time. There's just no reason to do that. And there's nothing to gain. And so, when you listen to Fletcher Prouty or some of these other people or just your own common sense, who had something to gain, right? Well, the mafia did, either through revenge or trying to get Cuba back for gambling or less prosecutions on them. The CIA did. They had all their heads fired. Allen Dulles fired. George Cabell fired. Others cleaned the house. Also, Kennedy stripped away a lot of power from the CIA with consecutive memos after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. They were reeling from that. In fact, he had this famous quote of, "I'm going to smash the CIA to 1,000 pieces." not something that you really want to say, right? Not something you really want to say. uh, uh, so there are a lot of Cuban exiles, right? Frustrated with Bay of Pigs, if they want to blame Kennedy for that. There are a lot of people that were upset with Kennedy, but I'm not sure Russia was one of them. If anything, they viewed him as soft. You know, what do you have? If you're sitting over there in your cruise ship, do you think LBJ is soft?
You know, I didn't realize until I started talking to you and learning about some of this history that, you know, LBJ was one tough character, and a lot of Americans don't know, you know, how tough Texas politics was back then. And there is a school of thought that LBJ, there was a theory that this was for political gain as well. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the context of Dallas and Texas political, you know, we'll call cowboy politics of the era, and just who was LBJ?
Sure. There was a book about LBJ that came out, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm trying to look it up right now, but I have a copy of it. But it came out before he was president, about all his issues in Texas. And he was very strong-armed, from falsifying votes to having people taken out, and I'll say taken out, murdered, including a guy that had been married to his sister, a policeman, investigators. He had a long, suspicious trail that had been covered up in Texas for many years. And if you come to Texas and talk about LBJ, unless you're just unenlightened educationally, there's really no one here that's very impressed with him, other than him being a very shrewd and tough and unethical politician. So when you take someone like that, and then something that happened to JFK, you have to scratch your head and wonder. Now, when I grew up, it was, you know, Oswald did it. And then it became, well, elements of the mob did it. And then it kind of became rogue elements of the CIA and maybe Cuban exiles that did it. And then now what you have, what's involved, and then rogue elements of, and then maybe a coordinated effort of some higher ups at the CIA. And now what you have, which I think is probably the most popular accepted theory amongst hardcore JFK researchers, because a lot of us are looking at the same evidence and we get together and we talk these things over, is it's all of those things. You know, Oswald may not have pulled the trigger, but he was a CIA top level crypto clearance agent.
Let's talk about Oswald. He's not just some communist, you know, that ends up in Mexico. I mean, he has a very interesting history with, like you said, high-level clearance, high-level training. Maybe you can talk a little bit about his background for our viewers.
You know, probably 6 months, a couple hours a day on on Oswald, and it's really interesting. But yes, he went to illusionary warfare training in North Carolina. He had crypto clearance. He worked in radar over in Japan. He was very involved with the U-2 spy plane, very involved with the U-2 spy plane incident with Gary Powers. He defected over to Russia in a really strange deal. The Russians, he tried to join, you know, their intelligence. They wouldn't take him. And so he comes back to the U.S. Now, both trips in and out of Russia were exceptionally easy. In fact, the State Department gave him a bunch of money when he came back to Texas. And he brought back a wife, right? A wife whose uncle was a high-level KGB agent, whose wife is still alive today and lives in Garland, Texas. And all extremely suspicious, right? And he gets into Arlington and New Orleans. Both crowds that he's running around with, if you follow those stories, are just unbelievable, stranger than fiction type stuff. I mean, you can't write this kind of stuff. In Texas, he had a Russian agent handler here who wound up getting killed right before he was supposed to testify before the House Select Committee of Assassinations. And New Orleans, even stranger things are going on. He's working with Jack Ruby. He's working with Tulane and finding and working with others about a type of injectable cancer to kill Castro.
Think about that. So you said two things. You said one. So Oswald and Jack Ruby knew each other from, we'll call it, illicit activities in New Orleans.
Correct. And then witnesses in New Orleans and in Dallas that have seen them together. So it's not something you just sort of conjure up. There's plenty of witnesses for that.
And then this cancer injection, that's interesting given what we're going through today. So governments were engineering biological warfare, genomic warfare back in the 60s. Maybe talk a little more about that.
Yeah, there are two books. One is called Dr. Mary's Monkey, because they were using monkeys for this kind of stuff, and Her Mysterious Death in New Orleans. She was working on the program. The other one is Judith. I'll have to think of her last name here. I've got her book here. What's her name? Judith Baker. Judith Baker, who's still alive. You can visit with her. She's getting old. Judith Baker was like a high school super genius protege, won this big contest of science and got to do this internship for this doctor at Tulane, who was a well-renowned cancer doctor, but was also on the CIA payroll. And she winds up doing a lot of this research in her internship and injecting mice with this kind of stuff because she won this National Science Award in high school. She also starts to have a love affair with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. She's written a book about it. You can visit with her about it. You know, you're not going to see it in the media. No one ever covers it. But it's amazing, the documentation and the facts and the all the things that she has to prove up what she was doing. But their goal, they got to where they could inject the cancer and kill you within a day or two. And strangely enough, by the way, even though Jack Ruby was working on that, that's how he died.
Interesting. And, you know, the book's called Me and Lee by Judith Baker. And she, I guess, talks about her love affair, how she met him. But it's funny that Ruby died in a similar type of way. And so Oswald's this sordid character. Mm-hmm.
She's like a super mensa. So when you talk to her, she's going to seem a little bit weird. You know, people are like that when they talk like that. But she's incredibly smart and an incredible expert on the assassination.
So let's go back to Dallas, you know, the day of the assassination. And so the book repository, there's somebody in there, the president's motorcade's coming. Maybe take us through, just from your view, some of the jigsaw puzzle pieces that most people don't know were occurring as you start to climb that ladder and look down on the ballroom.
Sure. Well, you know, you have to start with the Secret Service, right? That parade route should have never been picked. And it's really odd that it was. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, we learned a lot from the assassination on, you know, how to improve the Secret Service and coverage from the president and protect him and this, that, and the other, you know, because there was no one on buildings, on the top of buildings. We shouldn't have drove down through there in an open convertible. We shouldn't have had open windows. We should have had more of a police force. We should have had a different formation with the motorcycles out in front and on the side. All of these things, people say, you know, were lessons that the Secret Service learned. And the answer to all that is poppycock. All of those things were known beforehand, and all of those policies were changed for this president, which is really amazing. So when you look at that, they didn't use a wedge. They use them in other places. They used them in Tampa. They used them in Chicago. They used them that year all the time. In fact, there's video of Emory Roberts, who's in charge in the backup car, telling Don Lawton to get off the car. You know how the Secret Service get on the car and ride with them? Get off the car. And the video, Don Lawton's going, what? Why? What's wrong with you guys? And he throws his hands up in exasperation. It's on YouTube. Type it in. That's the neat thing about research nowadays. It's so easy to research. You just type it in, and there it is. And you look at that and you go, why would you have this kind of discrepancy on the president of the United States? Why would you have open windows? How could anybody get a rifle out of any window? They changed the parade route in violation of policy. Wrong route. You can't do a turn more than 90 degrees. It was in the policy book at the time. They were supposed to go straight down Main Street, out under the Stemmons Freeway triple underpass. Instead, they turned right on Houston Street and down left on Elm Street, which was a 45-degree angle, and they went too slow, almost breaking the car to a stop at the X where he was shot. And the X is where he's caught in a crossfire. Everything shot at once. The example I like to use in presentations is a 21-gun salute. If you've ever been to a military funeral, you do a 21-gun salute. Do you hear 21 gunshots? No, you hear 3.
Do not.
Boom, boom, boom. If you close your eyes during any of those, pull it up on YouTube, you will hear 3 gunshots, but there are 21 rifles all shooting. So people go, you couldn't coordinate that. Poppycock, easy. Really, really easy. So that shouldn't have happened. There was no protective military presence. The police wedge was behind. They violated the turn. They slowed to a near halt. The agents were unresponsive when it happened, except for Hill, who jumped on the back. Clint Hill, who jumped on the back of the limousine, who was Jackie's personal Secret Service agent. And then they didn't stop there. You know, when the limo got to Parkland Hospital, the first thing they did was wash the limo down. Who does that? Really? This is the Secret Service here. These guys are above average IQ. You know, a monkey would know that you don't wash away evidence, especially when your president's been shot. A monkey would know that. They washed it clean and sent the limo to be repaired. And on Monday morning, it was back the way it was, ready for use again. Windshield repaired. They had a gunshot bullet through it, the whole bit. All by Monday, the substitute window destroyed. All bullet holes repaired.
Well,
so that's where
so
I started the Secret Service and driving the president down there. And it goes way, way deeper than that. The evidence we have nowadays that the Secret Service blew it so bad, and as you called it earlier, a series of multiple coincidences. You know, if you have enough coincidences, the odds are they're not coincidences.
Right. No, that's right. Well, so the coroners come in and they say there's a bullet hole in his throat, not in the back of his head. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the coroner report and maybe some of the folks, because you host a conference here in Dallas and you've gotten a lot of very interesting historical figures, many of which most Americans don't know about, that were there or part of the process or part of the investigation. What did the doctors, what did the medical community here say in Dallas?
Well, you know, you can look up the old press in the YouTube again and say, and they come out and they'll say, right at the time of the assassination, the president has an entrance wound right here. He has an entrance wound up here, right? Now, the problem with that is, you know, if Oswald is a lone assassin at the top of the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, he couldn't have shot him from the front. And if he couldn't have shot him from the front, that means we have a conspiracy because there's multiple people involved. And that's always been the controversy. So the whole goal of the Warren Commission or the FBI is dependent on one guy. So they have to cover up the front, right? Well, every single doctor is saying, hey, it's the front, it's the front. And then they get threatened. So as an example, some of these guys don't ever talk about it for years. In fact, I had a guy a couple of years ago, I guess 2 years ago, maybe 3, come to my conference. The first time he ever publicly talked about it, he had been hammered at the Warren Commission to change his testimony. His life threatened, the whole bit. He went back to Amarillo and stayed quiet all these years. And now he's in his 80s and he feels guilty. And he comes out and he does this wonderful, fantastic speech. You can see it on our Zoom recording, and about exactly what he went through. And he'll look you in the eye and say, the entrance wound was here, and it was here. And so did another doctor that I had. And but one of them just passed away. All of them agreed with that. Most of them, though, would not talk about it because they had their lives threatened. And so the autopsy became the biggest piece of evidence that came out of the Assassination Records Review Board. And the guy that headed that up, Doug Horn, wrote a big 5-volume book about that, because a bunch of the records for the autopsy had come out. And I got to tell you, the autopsy is the strangest thing in the whole world. The guy that headed up had never done a gunshot wound autopsy. And the fraud in that autopsy, anybody, again, with room temperature IQ can look at the autopsy records and know that it was a fraud and cover up. Now, somebody might come in and say it was sloppy. No, no one could be that sloppy. Okay. So misplacing bullet wounds, lying about the bullet wounds, entrance wounds, exit wounds. When you have photos and things that were also doctored up, people that took photos were killed, all kinds of stuff going on with that autopsy. But that autopsy fraud started in Dallas when they took the body from Dallas. You know, Texas law had to be done in Texas. And they literally stole the body under gunpoint in a hallway to get it to Bethesda, Maryland, so that they could do it there.
So after the shots were fired, there's an officer, J.D. Tippit, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the controversy around him and what happened to him.
You know, there's a lot of controversy about Tippit. From 100,000 feet, you know, Tippit's patrolling South Dallas and is killed by Oswald in the street. Now, the controversy starts with the witnesses. Witnesses are saying there were two guys, or that it wasn't Oswald. They say, you know, they're either silenced or they don't talk anymore, or they don't want to talk anymore because they've been talking. Even if you look, they could never, most people don't even know this, they could never match the gun to the bullet. The bullet, it didn't match. And then the bullets that they turned in weren't the bullets that, you know, an officer will mark his initials on evidence. And they weren't the right bullets. So if you go to the National Archives today, it's the wrong bullet. One of the bullets is wrong. What's going on? Who's tampering with this evidence? Who's going into the National Archives and changing what's happening? So, you know, that whole thing is a mess. It even gets crazier. I hate to even tell you this, but there's this whole conspiracy about, and there's very credible evidence on the autopsy table. I hate bringing this up because it sounds so far-fetched, but that the bodies of Tippit and Kennedy were switched, and that he was picked because he looked like it. In fact, if you talk to people who work with him, they always used to say, you look like JFK. And even Jackie and Robert Kennedy, looking at his body, said, well, that's not him. And that whole study on how the bodies were switched and why they were switched and who was the surgeon that did that is an incredible story. But, you know, obviously, you know, a little deep to get into today.
Wow. So you're saying that he was shot once. Tippit was shot once in the back of the head, and you think that they may have swapped the bodies between the officer and the president. And so where is Tippit buried?
Well, there's a theory that he may be buried at Arlington National Cemetery.
And where is the expected body? So if the swapped body, then if they did swap the body, where did the officer that was shot, where did they bury him? Was he? I hope he wasn't cremated.
Tippit was the officer.
Tippit was the officer, but you know they gave a body to his family and then a body to Jackie O. if they swap the bodies.
Yeah, my memory serves me correctly. That was a closed casket funeral. They didn't get seen.
Which would make sense on a head wound, but I mean, wouldn't it be really easy to? I mean, no one's going to exhume the body of JFK at Arlington, but could the family of Tippit do a DNA sample?
Yeah, absolutely. You would think, right? If they wanted to. This happened with Oswald back in the 80s. They dug up his grave to see if it was him. They were worried about it being a body double. I wasn't really worried about it at the time. I thought that was probably him. But he did have a double.
Oswald had a double? Why would he have a double?
Well, he had a double going around town while he was in New Orleans, going to a gun range. And he went to the gun range and he would shoot at another guy's target and then, spout off and talk about what a great marksman he is and that he could kill anybody he wants to and how much he hates Kennedy. Right. And then he goes into a gun store and does the same, buying ammunition. Then he goes to a car dealer and is kind of kicking tires, looking at the car, and he's bitching about how he hates Kennedy and wishes he was dead, all this kind of stuff. So if there are witnesses around town saying what a bad guy he was, right? And Oswald wasn't in any of those spots. Kind of interesting. So the whole body double thing on Oswald is interesting as well. People think, man, this stuff is just too far-fetched. But unless you understand the clandestine operations of what the CIA was capable of at the time, they are the only kind of organization that could pull off something like that. No one else could. If you think about, I've got to use the Bethesda hospital, military hospital, to do this fake autopsy. Boom, immediately you have to involve the U.S. government, right? So, that doesn't come from the mob. That doesn't come from Castro. That doesn't come from Cuba. That doesn't come from Russia. It doesn't come from Cuban exiles. That has to come from the government.
So deep state's been alive and well for many decades.
Yeah, it's really bad. And it's very disappointing on my part because I think I was very slow to come around to that theory. I'm such a patriotic, wave the flag, support the government kind of guy. And I certainly wouldn't say that all government is bad and all people are bad in the government. There are good people and there are bad people, and good people run a good government and bad people can run a bad government, right? It's a function of the people. And we had some bad people in charge, really bad people in charge.
Yeah, people is policy, that's for sure. So there's a Dallas Morning News reporter named Hugh Ainsworth, and supposedly Hugh somehow obtained this Oswald diary. Is there legitimacy to this? How did he obtain it, or what's in the diary?
I don't know. I know Hugh. He's still alive. He's very old. I had him speak at one of my conferences. He was the only man that was there during the assassination, there when Oswald got shot, and at the theater when Oswald was captured. In fact, I had him at our conference. We were at the Texas Theater, and it kind of gave him the chills because he had not been in the Texas Theater since that day Oswald was caught, and it kind of freaked him out a little bit. But he is a very ardent, lone nut Oswald guy. And he used to cover science and space and was switched over to the assassination after it happened. He was very well respected in Dallas. He's been accused of being on the CIA payroll. He was just ardent, anti-flamethrowing Jim Garrison under the bus, making up all kinds of stuff that turned out many years later known to be true. So Hugh is of a questionable motives in writing about Oswald. And as much as I like the man, I see him at these sixth floor exhibit events and this, that, and the other. And he's holding to his own about Oswald in spite of all the evidence against it. And it just doesn't make any sense because he's very smart and he's been caught on the wrong side for a lot of things that he wrote in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, so was there anything that came of the diary? I mean, so he's basically pushing the Oswald theory, but was there anything that was in the diary that was notable that led him to believe, or he uses evidence to project his theory?
If there was anything in that diary that showed a conspiracy, it was ripped out. Okay. Now, if you want to learn about conspiracy and Oswald, you have to go to two main sources that are still around. One is Marina Oswald, who probably doesn't really like talk too much about it anymore, and Judith Baker. Judith Baker knows more than anyone because she had an affair with him. And I guess you could say alleged affair, but she has a lot of proof. She has a lot of proof. And if you read her book, you go, no one would go through the trouble to forge the documents and forge the evidence and write a book like that. It wouldn't make any sense. Why would they do that? I mean, maybe they want some kind of crazy notoriety or whatever, but
well, let me ask you one question. So, if you're going with the deep state theory, this rogue element, are there similarities between the JFK assassination and the RFK assassination? I mean, to have two brothers assassinated, low probability. What are your
right? And you probably know about that one. And Sirhan is the poster child for MK Ultra, right? Comes in to start shooting. Now, RFK shot in the back of the head. And there's, I don't know what, 12, 16 bullet holes, I can't remember, in that kitchen where he was shot. You can't get that many bullets out of his gun. The whole RFK thing is really interesting. He had just announced that he was going to get to the bottom of the assassination. And he never said that before. But he was feeling pretty confident. He was polling very well in California. And he was thinking, you know what? It's been burning in him all these years. He always thought the CIA had been behind it. He asked them. They told him no. He didn't believe them. And he kept quiet about it. And then he made that statement. And next thing you know, he's dead. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that he's part of the JFK problem. There's a book called The Inheritance. And you talk about crazy. What happened is all the contents of the White House Oval Office were with Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary. And when he's killed, RFK gets Evelyn Lincoln, hey, get all that stuff out and put it in my office. And we'll hide it and we'll keep it. And we're not going to register it with any of the agencies, the FBI or anything else. And we'll need it. So these are tapes and evidence and all kinds of stuff. And he sits on it and then he's killed. Now, Evelyn Lincoln's stuck with this stuff and nobody knows about it. She has no kids. And she runs off to Europe for a long time with her husband, and he dies. She comes back to America and she befriends this guy and wills it to him. And the guy's kind of semi-opportunist, ne'er-do-well, who has a friend who has a bunch of money. And that guy bankrolls it. And next thing you know, they have all these contents when Evelyn Lincoln has died. And they decide they're going to put it up for auction. And I remember seeing it on CNN, advertising for this auction at Trump Tower in New York and all these things, a rocking chair and JFK watch and all this stuff. I'm like, where the hell did this come from? And it was a real buzz in the research community. Well, next thing you know, that stuff starts to disappear. One of the guys dies. The author's girlfriend dies, her mother dies, his lawyer dies, and he gets put in federal prison for 10 years. And you have this book called The Inheritance after he gets out. And it is some really scary stuff, but it's basically talking about what he's found out linking RFK and JFK and all this evidence. Just to give you one piece of evidence is a watch. He has this Cartier watch that Kennedy was wearing during the assassination. Kennedy had no jewelry on, nothing, cufflinks, nothing. They had taken it out of his bedroom the night before, and on the plane from Fort Worth to Dallas, Jackie gives him this watch because he's complaining he couldn't find his stuff. And she says, well, here, I have this watch, and it's got this engraving of their wedding date on it. And he's wearing it. Why is this watch important? Because it wasn't tested. It wasn't tested for mercury. Why is that important? Because Oswald supposedly was shooting a Mannlicher Carcano rifle. It is not a high-velocity weapon. If you have people that know anything about weapons and high-speed bullets, they got mercury in them. They explode, right? And if you look at the Zapruder film, you can clearly see his head explode on the third shot, not on the first one. Well, Mannlicher Carcano can't shoot a high-velocity weapon. It's impossible. So if we test that watch and it has mercury on it, we know A, it was a high-velocity weapon that killed him, and B, Oswald didn't do it because he didn't have a high-velocity weapon up there. They tested the watch. It had mercury all over. And there began Christopher's problems.
And he was in jail, you said, for 10 years. What did he go to jail for?
They accused him of bank fraud, falsifying financial statements for a bank. If you get $1 off on your financial statement for a bank, then they got you for bank fraud. So it kind of makes you feel, we deal with banks here at Commerce Street every day, and it makes you feel kind of exposed if you were ever to do anything adversarial to the government, because they could, they're going to find something wrong if they want to, or they'll make it up. There was a guy named Tosh Plumley. This is a different story. Tosh was here in Dallas, lied about his age, joined the Army, was a little bit rambunctious, but extremely intelligent when they tested him out. So they put him in the CIA, and he did illusionary warfare training in North Carolina with, guess who? The R.V. Oswald and some others that are involved in assassination. He became a pilot for the CIA. He flew arms and guns for Batista, and then for Castro, and then for the anti-Castros, and then for the CIA and the mob. And there's all kinds of stories about that, which are very interesting. But the day of the assassination, he's in Dallas. He had been called by the Pentagon to fly as a co-pilot from Miami JM Wave, pick up an abort team to abort an assassination attempt on the president. Now, the use of the word of abort versus prevent is kind of interesting. You can draw your own conclusion. He gets to Dallas. He's on the south side of the grassy knoll. And as an extra witness, they needed another spotter. He's on his walkie-talkie. All of a sudden, it quits working as Kennedy drives down Houston Street. Boom, the president's shot. He says one of the bullets comes from behind his ear. This is South Knoll, not North Knoll. Okay. And, they hightail it out of there. They get to the plane. Several of the guys are missing. They're all sad. They fly to Miami, very quiet. When he lands, the FBI meets him on the airport and says, you weren't supposed to go to Dealey Plaza. We're going to arrest you for a $50 hot check. He gets arrested. He goes to jail. He tries to call his handler, John Hurt, out of North Carolina, who, by the way, is the same guy that Oswald tried to call from jail, but the FBI wouldn't let him. They blocked the call, John Hurt, which I found really interesting because Plumley, when I asked him, didn't know that Oswald had tried to call Hurt. So that was a piece of the puzzle that I was able to put together. And Hurt tells him, hey, stay in jail. It's too hot. He gets released 1 month after the Warren Commission report comes out. And that's just one small story with Tosh Plumley. He gets involved with Iran-Contra. Barry Seal, all of that kind of stuff later on, if you know those stories.
Can neither confirm nor deny. Well, Dory, I mean, let me ask you one question. So what is your thought? What do you think happened, given that you've been studying this? And who are some of the leading historical academics that you follow for people if they want to continue the journey?
You know, it's an interesting thing. It is a rabbit hole. It can't consume you, and it's not positive and uplifting. So I will study it usually from maybe September through November, and then I quit. I got to go do the Bible or something different because it's just not uplifting. It's depressing. But at the same time, it's really fascinating whodunit, probably the most fascinating in history. A lot of people had it right from the get-go. If you go rent the movie Executive Action in 1971, we got 80-90% of it right. And the movie was so far-fetched for its time, the public wasn't ready for it. Everyone believed the press. Everyone believed, Dan Rather. Everyone believed Walter Cronkite. Everyone believed everything the government told them at that time. In today's world, people don't trust the news, and they don't trust everybody. So it would be a little harder to pull off nowadays. You could probably pull it off, but nobody would believe you. But at that time, people believed it for the first 5 or 7 years, and then they started to not believe. So Executive Action is a good movie to see. It has Burt Lancaster in it. And interestingly, Burt Lancaster's in another movie that I'd suggest you watch called 7 Days in May. John F. Kennedy was reading a book called 7 Days in May. And he said, man, this is fantastic. This is how they're going to kill me if I die. So he called his friends in Hollywood and said, you guys need to make this movie. And if you make this movie, maybe I won't get killed. They made the movie and he gets killed anyway. Most people don't know about it. But they're both really good. Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster, and that's a good thriller. And you can get the 100,000-foot view from 7 Days in May and a little more detail on exactly how it was done from Executive Action. It's not 100% correct because we've had new evidence since then, but you get the general idea.
Wow. Well, 1963, there's obviously distrustful media activity. There's genetic, warfare going on. There's voter fraud. There's deep state active. I mean, nothing's changed from 1963 into 2020, 2021. It's interesting how history may not repeat itself but rhymes. And I think you're right. In this environment, people, our viewers, they're asking deeper questions, trying to find sources to help them find the news and get through the dissonance of all the noise. But Dory, I appreciate you coming on the show, sharing your thoughts and your passion project with us. It's fascinating. And if anything, it gives people, pause to think about what's been going on historically around the world and, how it maybe correlates into the pandemic of what we're going through today. And, my takeaway is it was definitely Fidel Castro. That's definitely my story, and I'm sticking to it. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
You and I will go get some bourbon, and I'll talk to you about why it wasn't Castro. But I do want to tell you, I appreciate your comments because today's world, I think what I would say about is we all underestimate the evil of the lust for power. And it's a problem that's been going on through history. If you go to the Roman Empire and look at how many of those guys, Caesars and whatnot, that were assassinated and killed, it's no different today. And so what you see going on in D.C. today, we may not get people assassinated, but they get marginalized, which can be just as effective. And it definitely goes on.
Dory, thank you for joining us. And this is Non-Beta Alpha, and now you know.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Non-Beta Alpha. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube so you never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or simply share this episode with your friends. And now you know.
price references and market forecasts correspond to the date of this recording. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. The information contained in this podcast does not constitute research or recommendation from Non-Beta Alpha Inc., Wentworth Management Services LLC, or any of their affiliates to the listener. Neither Non-Beta Alpha Inc., Wentworth Management Services LLC, nor any of their affiliates make any representation or warranty as to the accuracy or completeness of the statements or any information contained in this podcast, and any liability therefore including in respect of direct, indirect, or consequential loss or damage is expressly disclaimed. The views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily those of Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC, and Non-Beta Alpha Inc. and Wentworth Management Services LLC are not providing any financial, economic, legal, accounting, or tax advice or recommendations in this podcast. In addition, the receipt of this podcast by any listener is not to be taken as constituting the giving of investment advice by Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC to that listener, nor to constitute such person a client of any affiliate of Non-Beta Alpha Inc. or Wentworth Management Services LLC. This does not constitute an offer to buy or sell any security. Investments in security may not be suitable for all investors. An investment of any security may involve risk and the potential loss of your initial investment. Investors should review all risk factors before investing. Investors should perform their own due diligence before considering any investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investment products, insurance, and annuity products are not FDIC insured, not bank guaranteed, not insured by a federal government agency, may lose value.